Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback, and on today's episode in this build video for Grimdawn, we're getting into part 2 of the Vindicator build. This is going to be your Inquisitor and Shaman class put together, and it is a lightning focused build with a whole lot of damage packed right behind it, as you can see. If you haven't checked out the first video in this guide, I recommend going back over to that one so you can get your idea on how the base abilities work, as well as some early game devotions that should set you up quite nicely to get to level 50 in this build. This video will be primarily focused on one more passive ability between both of these classes and a couple more devotions before we get into some early game monster infrequents, as well as a legendary helmet that, if you can find the blueprint for, will be extremely helpful in building this kit up to do even more lightning damage. To kick us off though, let's pick up the single ability that we didn't manage to get to in the last video, and that is going to be the Stormcaller's Pact. This is going to be an exclusive skill, and as such you will not be able to take the other shaman ability called Primal Bond, but that's more pet focused, so you're not going to have to worry that much about that. You will, however, be missing out on the Aura of Conviction and the Aura of Censure on the Inquisitor side of things, but neither of those deal with lightning damage, and that is our main focus for this build. You may be a little bit upset about losing some elemental resistance shred from the Aura of Censure, but ultimately, all the damage that we can get out of this passive is going to be much more beneficial. Stormcaller's Pact is going to give you a base electrocute damage in a pretty decent amount. You're going to get a whole bunch of crit damage and cold damage buffs as well. Not so much interested in that cold damage, but there are a couple things that overlap between these two damage types that will make that not the worst thing in the world. You also have a 33% chance at level 9 to do plus 315% lightning damage, being our main damage type. That is pretty significant. You're also going to get buffs to Frostburn and Electrocute damage over 100% at level 9, and then you're going to convert 15% of your physical damage into lightning damage as well. That in and of itself is going to make any weapon that you pick up, no matter what the damage base stat is to it, much more lightning centric than it could probably be otherwise. The last stat on Stormcaller's Pact that we're going to talk about is a resistance, and this is a reduced stun duration of a very significant amount. At level 9, we're looking at 24% reduction in that stun duration, and once we get this maxed out to level 12, we're going to be looking at 30% in its entirety. Having that big chunk of reduced stun duration taken care of by one of your passives rather than your items means that you're going to have a lot more freedom with what you do with your components and your augments as the game unfolds towards Ultimate. This build is incredibly squishy as it is right now because I haven't been focusing a lot on building up those resistances, but having any of them out of the way early on in normal is going to be a good thing, so we don't have to concentrate very hard when we get to Ultimate. We've also taken a couple points into Mogdrogan's Pact, but I don't know if I'm entirely sold on keeping this passive as of yet. I just wanted to see if it felt any better because of the way that the tanky stats work in this whole passive tree. So I'll get back to you in the next video to see if we're going to keep this ability or if we're going to funnel much more points into the damage aspects of this build. There are also a couple more devotions that we picked up in the meantime as well that we need to talk about, with the first being the Spider devotion. Spider is a 5-point devotion that will get you a 6 point Eldritch Affinity completion once you have completed this one. Not only that, but you're getting points into Cunning and Spirit. You're getting percentage increases to Cunning and Spirit as well. You're getting defensive ability in a pretty significant amount. All things told, once Spider is completed, you'll be getting 40 defensive ability and 40 offensive ability as well, making Spider a pretty significant contribution to those stats, no matter what difficulty you are in. The reason that we want those Eldritch, which are the green affinity points, however, are going to take us into one of our later constellations, which is going to be Altos, the Shepherd of Storms. Now we'll talk about that later once we are in that portion of the build, but just remember that's where the green is going to be used. After you've taken care of the Spider, however, you'll start making your way back up to the blue side of things, our primordial devotions, which will get us points into Tsunami. Tsunami is very, very consistent, at least for me as a player, in the amount of damage it can do, along with just how consistently it activates when you're using AoE abilities, just like this class is apt to do. Tsunami itself as a constellation is going to slightly buff lightning and cold damage, along with frostburn and electrocute damage as well, while giving you bumps to physique and spirit, some defensive ability, and ultimately the Tsunami ability. And if you have spent any time on this channel whatsoever with the builds that we go for, this is an extremely good devotion activated ability. Tsunami is going to fire off big waves of damage as it is activated, and it is going to do weapon damage, cold damage, lightning damage, frostburn damage, with a chance to both silence and blind targets that it hits. For those people who need the grimdawn specific terms, fumble and aim impairment are the silence and blind terms for grimdawn. That said, Tsunami deals about half of your weapon damage, so it'll be a lot less than we can normally get away with, especially in our last build, since we're only using a one-handed weapon along with a caster offhand in this build. However, that is still plenty because our lightning damage is obscene when it comes to the final stages of this build, and that will only be made better by the AoE damage coming from Tsunami. Remember from the last video as well, we already picked up Tempest, so if you missed out on that devotion, go back and check out that video because Tempest is going to be pretty important for this build and the method in which you deal damage. With all of that out of the way, however, I do want to start talking about some gear, because we've happened upon a couple of monster infrequents and a very, very nice legendary helmet that is available right at level 50. So once you hit 50, this is yet another power spike on the ultimate power trip that is the lightning focused Vindicator build, and that'll be towards the end. That said, however, the monster infrequents that you can pick up for this build are pretty easy to find, and they're going to get you a lot of points into things that make the most damage happen. We're actually going to start by talking about the Amulet for this build, and that is because it is relatively early that you can find it, and pretty easy to farm because it only drops from a single enemy. This is going to be Ulraprax's Sting, and you'll get this as you are finishing out homestead quests on your journey to take out the Dermapteran Queen. Even Ravna herself comes with some really great monster infrequents depending on the build that you're going for, but this one specifically you will find in a portion of the map called the Swarming Hive. This is one of the offshoots when you are down in the tunnels looking for Ravna to complete your quest, but the amulet in question is going to provide lightning and aether damage along with offensive ability and pierce resistance. It's going to give you +1 to all skills in your Inquisitor tree, and for your main hand ability, your signature ability in this build, we are going to add a whole bunch of flat electrocute damage over 2 seconds to the Stormbox of Elgaloth. That in and of itself is enough to take this monster infrequent early on, make sure it carries us through the build. If we do not find anything better, that very significant bump in damage is going to be plenty. Because this amulet is so early on, at least in comparison to the other gear in this build, the nicest part about it is that you know where it's going to be farmed, you know how often you can go down there to look for it, and you could probably find yourself some decent rolls as long as you were level 40 with the ability to actually wear this amulet. It's the first thing that you can really get as far as monster infrequents are concerned that is going to significantly buff your build, but that being said, there are other things in the monster infrequent gear realm that we're going to be looking for that are available after you get through Homestead and start making your way to the end of the base game. The next monster infrequent that you're going to want to hunt down is the Yeti horn, and the Yeti horn is available as you are traveling up towards Fort Icon from Homestead. The Yeti horn is a rare offhand item that is going to change your Wind Devil and your Stormbox of Elgaloth by providing some passive changes. It's also dealing cold and frostburn damage while buffing your electrocute damage, giving you some skill cooldown reduction and points into both of our big boy abilities, which are again the Wind Devil and the Stormbox of Elgaloth. That said, the passive changes that come along with the Yeti Horn are going to reduce the cooldown of Wind Devil, and they're going to give you one additional summon to your Wind Devils as well. So we're going to go from 3 up to 4, and we can summon them a lot quicker. That in and of itself is fantastic, because the more of them that you can have out, the more damage that they're going to deal, the easier they are to summon, the more that you can have out consistently. After all of those buffs to your Wind Devil, you're also going to get plus 24% crit damage to your Stormbox. So not only is that ability going to be absolutely incinerating everything that you hit the button on, it is going to deal even more crit damage to everything that you have a huge offensive ability advantage over. Since we're going to be stacking a lot of offensive ability as we progress through the game, this ability in and of itself should be hitting incredibly hard, even into Ultimate and those higher difficulties. The only problem really comes in when it comes to critting if the target's defensive ability is much, much higher, or just about the same as your offensive ability. Obviously, at that point, your crit chance goes down quite a bit, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. As far as farming this item goes, it is relatively simple because the roads leading up to Fort Icon are absolutely full of Yetis and plenty of Yeti hero enemies as well, so you can get a pretty decent chance to get a hold of this offhand, and since it's available from level 35 to actually equip, you should have absolutely no trouble picking one of these up within a decent amount of time and hooking it onto your character for maximum efficiency. Now, the very last item on our list is going to be a mythical helmet that is available from level 50. And if you are just starting out in the game, this helmet might be a little bit tough to pick up because it does come from a blueprint. The blueprint in question is for the Dread Mask of Gergoth, and this is the cheeky shaman-like skull-looking helm on our build at the moment, and you can actually pick it up as you get further into the game from a secret vendor. Now, when I say secret vendor, I just mean a vendor that is locked inside of a key dungeon, and that vendor is Vinylton. Vinylton is the secret vendor inside of the Ancient Grove key dungeon, so you'll need to get at least up to this point in the game if you want to go running through that dungeon and be able to talk to Vinylton. Vinylton is actually he's a big vine plant. Maybe they're called vine monsters. You've seen them in the video all over the place as it is right now, but he's a friendly one of those, and he will sell you the blueprint for the Dread Mask of Gergoth. This helmet specifically is incredibly good for our build and should not be overlooked if all you have to do is go into a key dungeon and pay some money for it. Now, when it comes to the mask and the stats itself, the base stats that you're going to get on the level 50 version of the mask are number 1 going to be buffs to all damage. You're going to get buffs to lightning and electrocute damage, as is consistent for our lightning build. We're getting defensive ability, energy regen per second, and as far as resistances go, we're getting elemental resistance and reduced stun duration. So that reduced stun duration is going to fit very nicely with our Stormcaller's Pact, buffing us up on a very tough to come by stat really early on. On top of that, this is going to give you points into your Storm Totem and your Storm Box of Elgaloth, forgetting the fact that it also gives points into Mortar Trap, which we are not going to use. The passive ability on the Dread Mask is going to be Lightning Bolt, and that is a 10% chance on attack, of which we do incredibly often. So a 10% chance really is absolutely nothing when it comes to this build, because of the amount of AoE that we have, the amount of damage that happens very, very often with this build. We can trigger that lightning bolt incredibly often. The lightning bolt itself, however, hits in a pretty decent 2-meter target area, and it is going to deal straight lightning damage with the ability to stun a target for 1 second. Those lightning bolts are incredibly useful, but more importantly, all of the passive stats, with the exception of that Mortar Trap, are invaluable for the build that we are going into. Now, this mask is very useful at level 50, but once we get to the mythical version and we can equip it at level 84, it will absolutely explode in usefulness for our late game function. That being said, we're going to hold on to that until we get to that level in the next couple videos, but just remember, this mask is nutty, and it will absolutely be something you want to look at either farming or building very early on. Now, there is one final monster infrequent that I do need to bring up, and the reason that this is last is because it is probably easier to farm up that Dread Mask blueprint than it is to go hunting for this metal. That being said, neither of them should be very difficult, but you know exactly where to look when it comes to that mask, and you just have kind of random chance on this metal. It is going to be the Wendigo eye. You do have to get into Act 5, and you'll have to start trudging through the swamps of Barrowholm and the Coven's Refuge in order to find this, but the Wendigo eye is going to significantly increase damage of your Word of Pain ability. In the next video, once we start getting this build into Elite, Word of Pain is going to become much more useful, and the Wendigo eye is going to change it enough that it can stand on its own as a DPS ability in your right-click slot. What the eye is going to do for Word of Pain, however, will be adding elemental damage, and it is going to be able to reduce defensive ability as well. So, Word of Pain at the moment is going to be slowing enemy attacks by a pretty insignificant amount, and it's going to be dealing cold and fire damage. The single point that we have into the modifier Word of Agony makes it do lightning damage as well, and it is also going to blind on a 15% chance, so we can't actually get hit in those melee circumstances where we get surrounded. All of this is going to culminate in Death Sentence as well. Death Sentence adding on elemental damage to the ability on top of the Wendigo Gaze, so we are pulling out an elemental damage ability in a very big, very short cooldown AoE right on top of all of our lightning nukes, and this ability is just going to help shred through everything that we come across. It also reduces Aether and Pierce resistance, along with some Chaos resistance, and as this build progresses, there may be some overlap between the Lightning and the Aether damage that makes that instrumental as well. Horn of Gandar does piercing damage, if you remember that. There hasn't been any change to that ability either, so when we go in with our Word of Pain, the horn itself is going to deal lots more damage while it confuses and sends everybody running in circles. Word of Pain, again, it doesn't sound like much early on, but it will get better the more points that we put into it, and those points are going to start appearing throughout Elite and Ultimate, so you should be able to see a pretty significant expansion of how this ability is going to affect how the build plays. That being said, however, that is the entirety of this video and all of the important things I think we needed to cover right around level 50. This build does an incredibly ridiculous amount of damage, so it's really hard to feel like the power spikes are jumping us up very high, even though they are. Just because the lightning damage does so much and the Stormbox itself is such a workhorse for the Vindicator doesn't mean that all of these other things aren't necessary while progressing. So once we get into Elite, hopefully things get a little bit more tame and the enemies get a little bit more challenging. But for the time being, this class is absolutely shredding all the content possible, and it is very difficult to die because everything that can kill you just can't live long enough to even attempt it. But at the very least, thanks so much for hanging out to the end. If you made it to this point, let me know down in the comments below, and we'll be back next week getting this bad boy into Elite and seeing just how well it stacks up when that health bar is truly put to the test. Thanks again, everybody, for hanging out, and peace out.